Welcome back to the training for our weekend prayer ministry, Divine Appointments. This is step 2 in our 5-step training program, Listening Behind the Words. As people come forward for prayer, one of the first things you ask for, of course, is, what is it that you would like me to pray for? You have introduced yourself and started to build rapport. And now it's time for you to listen intently to capture what it is they are wanting you to pray for. What are some things that can prohibit you from listening well? Well, if you're like me, I can start thinking about the response before the person is even done sharing what is on their heart. Because of the request, I may be thinking, how will I pray for this? But our goal is to listen intently. Listening well to not only capture their requests, but to listen behind their requests for the deeper challenge of faith they may be experiencing. So I invite you to listen intently for one of 3 themes in their request: a crisis of identity, a crisis of regret, and a crisis of control. So first, a crisis of identity. One reason a person comes for prayer is that they are going through a major life status change. This could be going through a divorce, loss of a spouse or a loved one, loss of a job, financial difficulties, or a medical prognosis. The pain they are experiencing during this time may be hindering them from seeing any joy or even a purpose for their future. Their identity is becoming wrapped around their loss. So a crisis of identity could sound an awful lot like, how could God do this to me? It's a crisis of how to trust God in facing a new future. Second, a crisis of regret. This is when someone comes forward with a strong case of the woulda, coulda, shouldas. We've all been there. This is the pain of wishing a do-over from the bad choice and the ramifications. Regret is often living with the pain of what their choice has caused for them and for their loved ones. It's a regret over how they spent their time, their money, questioning their values, priorities, and beliefs. A crisis of regret can sound an awful lot like, how could I have done this to myself? How could I have done this to the people I love? A crisis of how to embrace God's forgiveness, God's grace, to live with the losses one created. And then third, a crisis of control. We often have a false illusion that if I'm diligent, focused, or calculating enough, I will be able to control my future. We cannot control our own lives, of course, let alone another person's choices. A crisis of control can sound an awful lot like, how could they do this to me? It's a crisis for forgiveness of others. It can be a crisis for belief to trust and embrace God's forgiveness of others for the pain they've caused, their betrayal, and how one has been sinned against. As a person shares their request, our prayers for wisdom and insight into the underlying struggle of faith. Again, it is a faith to believe that God is greater and can cause all things to work together for good. It's important to know that a person's response to crisis can be a part of a normal grief cycle that one goes through in experiencing a tragedy. The 5 stages of grief and loss are denial and isolation, anger, bargaining with God, depression, and then acceptance. People who are grieving do not necessarily go through the stages in the same order or experience every stage. The grief cycle is one that we need, though, to embrace. As we listen behind the words for these themes, our desire in prayer is to touch a deep nerve of acknowledgement and validation while we look to lead them in trusting God's power, presence, and purpose for their circumstances. Our next video will cover how to respond in empathy to a person coming forward for prayer.